I'm Nima Rajan. Canadians will likely be heading to the polls next month in a federal election. A Liberal Party source says Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is planning to meet with Governor-General Mary Simon on Sunday to ask her to dissolve Parliament and trigger an election. The vote is expected to be held on September 20th after a 36-day campaign. The Liberals, who need 170 seats for a majority, currently have 155 in the 338-seat House of Commons. The Conservatives have 119, while the Bloc Québécois has 32, the NDP 24, and the Greens have 2. There are 5 independents and 1 seat is vacant. Meanwhile, the federal opposition is denouncing the possibility of an early election. They are accusing the Liberals of wanting to send Canadians to the polls during a pandemic for the sole purpose of trying to win a majority. They say that's unnecessary and reckless. This comes as leading health officials say the country is now in the grip of a 4th wave of COVID-19. The country's chief public health officer is out with a warning. Dr. Theresa says the COVID-19 case count is on the upswing. She says the latest national figures indicate a 4th wave is underway, with infections showing a strong resurgence.
We have been closely monitoring increases in COVID-19 activity across the country. The latest national surveillance data indicate that a 4th wave is underway in Canada, and that cases are plotting along a strong resurgence trajectory.
She says there are now more than 13,000 active cases across the country, which is more than double over the past 2 weeks. Dr. Tam also says the new wave is being driven by the much more infectious Delta variant, with unvaccinated people making up the vast majority of new cases. Well, meanwhile, Canada is donating the 10 million single COVID-19 vaccine doses it purchased from Johnson & Johnson to less affluent countries. Procurement Minister Anita Anand announced the donation through the COVAX Vaccine Sharing Alliance. Health Canada authorized the J&J vaccine in early March, but it's never been used here. As the situation in Afghanistan worsens, with the Taliban gaining more ground, Ottawa is ready to send Canada's special forces to help evacuate the Canadian embassy in Kabul. There's no word yet on the number of troops that will be deployed, but the U.S. government is rushing 3,000 soldiers to the Kabul airport to help with a partial evacuation of its embassy. Britain is also sending troops, about 600, to help UK nationals leave the country. The federal government says it will enact legislation that will legalize single-game sports betting in Canada on August 27th. Justice Minister David Lametti says Bill C-218 will allow Canadians to bet on individual games in a regulated and safe environment. The Conservative private member's bill garnered enthusiasm from legislators in all 4 main parties. It's aimed at winning back customers from offshore sites, U.S. casinos, and illegal bookmakers. The federal government is investing $1.44 billion in Telesat's advanced low Earth orbit satellite constellation, Telesat Lightspeed. The federal government says the technology will help provide high-speed internet access in rural and remote parts of the country. Its investment includes a $790 million repayable loan and a $650 million preferred share equity investment. Ontario's Superior Court of Justice has certified a class action lawsuit against Uber Technologies. The class action was filed by Samfiru Tumarkin, LLP, and Uber Eats driver David Heller in 2017. It argues that Uber couriers should be entitled to minimum wage, vacation pay, and other protections because they meet the definition of employees under Ontario's Employment Standards Act. Uber has avoided offering drivers and couriers benefits by touting their work arrangement offers people the flexibility to drive or deliver as little or as much as they want. Projectors began lighting up the big screens at many Cineplex theaters over the spring, but Canada's biggest cinema chain still faced another quarter of deep losses. The impact of theater closures from COVID-19 and moviegoers still cautious about returning to multiplexes continued to wreak havoc on the company's financial results in the second quarter. It's reporting a loss of almost $104 million. Cineplex also introduced a ticket price increase across the country, which its chief executive tells the Canadian press is about 3% on average. Hudson's Bay Company is separating its department stores from its websites. The historic Canadian retailer says its e-commerce marketplace will operate as the Bay, while its brick-and-mortar stores will operate as Hudson's Bay. HBC says it aims to elevate the shopping experience for customers online and in-store. All right, stay with us. A new exhibit hopes to share the stories of Indigenous travelers and the importance of canoes in their heritage and how this all ties into reconciliation and healing in Canada. We'll have an interview with Mr. Frank Brown of the Sacred Journey exhibit coming up next, so stay tuned. We'll be right back after this short break. For thousands of years, ocean-going canoes were essential to the cultural and spiritual traditions of coastal First Nations. A new Indigenous exhibit captures the resurgence of these tribal canoe journeys. Showcasing the resilience and resourcefulness of Indigenous peoples, the Sacred Journey exhibit allows museum goers to immerse themselves into Indigenous Pacific coastal histories. This is done through metaphoric art, audio, video displays, and other interactive experiences. With plans to tour across Canada, the exhibit is one of many that shares Indigenous narratives to aid the process of reconciliation. Well, joining us now is Mr. Frank Brown, who is, among other things, a curator at the Sacred Journey exhibit and a Heiltsuk Nation hereditary chief. Sir, welcome to Forum Daily News.
Thank you for your interest in sharing our story.
Sir, so let's start with this. Where did the idea for this very interesting exhibit come from?
Our community hosted the tribal canoe journeys in Bella Bella, and we wanted to commemorate that hosting of the canoe nations from the Pacific Northwest coast. So we thought we should organize this exhibition called the Sacred Journeys to share to a larger audience the history of the resurgence of the ocean-going canoes. So I would say it came from our community of Bella Bella.
And can you give us some more detail on the significance and history of canoes in particular, and especially their importance to coastal First Nations?
For the people of the Pacific Coast, the canoe is imperative for our very existence. We live in the coastal realm, and in order to harvest the abundance of the sea, it was necessary to gather seafood and other food sources. We built clam gardens, harvested herrings, bottom fish, salmon. And so without the ocean-going canoe, we wouldn't be who we are.
Now, sir, I want to touch on a very significant event that happened between 1884 to 1951. The federal government banned the potlatch ceremony at that time. So what kind of impact did that have on the culture of West Coast nations, along with individual communities and canoe travel as well?
Well, the ban of the potlatch, amongst other things, such as residential school, had a devastating effect on our communities. And prior to that, there was a series of epidemics that burned its way up the coast, carried by ocean-going canoes. And it's the ocean-going canoe that brought devastating changes to our communities. And now today, it's the ocean-going canoe that's bringing life and the revitalization of culture and language and connecting youth to elders.
Now, sir, just about 2 minutes left here, but what is the significance of this exhibit, in your own words, and all Indigenous-led exhibits in terms of reconciliation and healing within Canada?
Well, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission gave some pretty specific recommendations, and one of them was for museums to make sure that the history of what happened to our people wouldn't be forgotten. And so they suggested documenting it and writing curriculum to be able to share in the education system. And this is a very important part of our decolonization and empowerment of our communities, and is in some ways considered one of the most significant gathering of the Indigenous peoples in the Americas today. And this exhibition celebrates the gathering of the canoe nations from not only the Pacific Northwest coast, but we've had Indigenous people from New Zealand, from Hawaii, from the Ainu from Japan. So it's a symbol of revitalization and community empowerment.
All right, sir, just about a minute left, but how can our viewers, everyday Canadians, get involved and learn more about this exhibit, along with other exhibits like it? It seems that our cameras have frozen here, but sir, are you back with us now? Our sincerest apologies, everyone. It seems that we have lost Heiltsuk Hereditary Chief Frank Brown due to some internet connection issues, but we did touch on some very important points. So if you'd like to learn more about this exhibit, you can visit sacredjourneyexhibit.com. Now stay tuned. We've got our national segment coming up next. Top headlines coming after the break as the BC Wildfire Service anticipates more new fires in the province. Meanwhile, Saskatchewan's post-secondary students wait on a vaccination decision, and Manitoba wildfires leave First Nations communities without power. We'll have these stories and more news from around the world coming up next on the Forum Daily, so stay tuned, everyone. We'll be right back after these short messages from our sponsors. We'll see you soon. The number of fires burning in BC stands at 269, but the Wildfire Service says new fires are expected to be sparked by the hot and dry weather baking the province. Information Officer Erica Berg noted yesterday that fires are usually at their peak during the midday heat, but relatively high nighttime temperatures combined with low humidity are also hindering firefighting efforts after sunset. There is some slight relief in the forecast as cooler temperatures are expected by Sunday. The Delta variant of COVID-19 is continuing to fuel a surge of infections in BC. This is leading health officials to enact mandatory vaccine requirements for all staff and volunteers at long-term care and assisted living sites. The province's top doctor says the call was made because people living in such settings are at particular risk, and transmission from unvaccinated people has led to outbreaks. The deadline for staff, volunteers, and personal service providers to be vaccinated is October 12th. The Alberta government is walking back its decision to eliminate isolation requirements for people who test positive for COVID-19 after weeks of pressure from local leaders, physicians, and Alberta families. Dr. Dina Hinshaw, the province's chief medical officer of health, says the government will also extend a masking mandate for public transit and continue testing and tracing as cases spike. All public health restrictions were scheduled to lift on Monday, but will now stay in place for another 6 weeks. Post-secondary students in Saskatchewan are still waiting to hear if their schools will require them to have COVID-19 vaccines. The University of Saskatchewan, University of Regina, and Saskatchewan Polytechnic all say they will release a statement in the coming days. The University of Toronto and other schools in some provinces are requiring students to show proof of vaccination. Wildfires in Manitoba have left a pair of First Nations communities without power. Officials say the damage caused by the blaze could leave locals waiting for months before repairs can be completed and the lights can come back on. Manitoba Hydro says engineering staff are now working on a plan to replace the damaged power poles, but note that they are located in extremely challenging terrain. Ontario's opposition parties are calling on the Conservative government to use COVID-19 money to make schools safer for children returning to classrooms next month. They say the recently announced $2.2 billion should be spent now rather than setting it aside for some future use. The Ontario Medical Association is also pressing for mandatory vaccinations for teachers and other school staff. Ontario has launched an incentive program aimed at recruiting and retaining staff in retirement homes. The province says the new program will be managed by the Registered Practical Nurses Association of Ontario. It says the 2-year funding will provide new and recently hired personal support workers and nurses with financial incentives to work in retirement homes. PSWs will receive an incentive of $5,000 for a minimum of 6 months, and nurses will receive $10,000 for 1 year. Quebec will test a smartphone application over the next 2 weeks that will run the vaccine passport system the government plans to impose across the province on September 1st. The passport would be used in settings with a high degree of contact, such as festivals, bars, restaurants, and gyms. Health Minister Christian Dubé says the application will read the QR code sent to people who have been vaccinated against COVID-19, adding that both businesses and clients will need to download the software. Well, meanwhile, Quebec opposition parties say the provincial government's refusal to hold a debate in the legislature on its plan to impose a vaccine passport system reflects a larger problem with its use of emergency powers. Quebec Premier François Legault says a debate isn't needed on the decision. Mr. Legault says the three main opposition parties agree that a vaccine passport system is needed to prevent COVID-19 transmission. He adds that opening up a debate or committee hearings on the issue would expose Quebecers to dangerous ideas. Two opposition parties, Québec Solidaire and the Parti Québécois, say they want to make sure the health order is temporary and fair. New Brunswick's top doctor is calling on all parents to ensure children 12 and over are vaccinated before the start of the school year. With roughly 19,000 teenagers yet to get their first doses of COVID-19 vaccine, Dr. Jennifer Russell says now is the time. Newfoundland and Labrador education officials say the upcoming school year will begin as normal as long as case counts and risk of community transmission stay low. Officials say provincial schools will operate based on community transmission risk, and different measures will be used for schools in low-risk and high-risk communities. Low-risk schools will proceed without mandatory masks or social distancing, while both protocols may have to be reintroduced if a school is deemed as high risk. All right, we give you a look at what's making news around the world after the break as the Taliban captures three more cities in Afghanistan. Germany commemorates the construction of the Berlin Wall, and the death toll rises in Turkish flooding. We'll have these stories and more international news coming up after the break on the Forum Daily, so stay tuned, everyone. We'll be right back after this short break. The Taliban have captured another three provincial capitals in southern Afghanistan, including Helmand. The province was the scene of some of the heaviest fighting over the past 2 decades. The insurgents are pressing a lightning offensive Friday that is gradually encircling the capital, Kabul. The loss of Helmand's provincial capital comes after years of toil and blood spilled by American, British, and allied NATO forces. Hundreds of foreign troops were killed there over the course of the nearly 2-decade war. The insurgents have taken more than a dozen provincial capitals in recent days and now controls more than 2/3 of the country. Meanwhile, the Pentagon is rushing 3,000 fresh troops to the Kabul airport to help with a partial evacuation of the U.S. Embassy in Kabul. The move comes after the Taliban captured Kandahar, which is Afghanistan's second-largest city and the birthplace of the Taliban movement. The State Department says the embassy will continue functioning, but Thursday's decision to bring in additional U.S. troops suggests waning confidence in the Afghan government's ability to hold off the Taliban surge. On Friday, Germany commemorated 60 years since the day East German authorities started building the Berlin Wall. German President Frank-Walter Steinmeier called its construction in 1961 the beginning of the end for the communist regime. The Berlin Wall stretched for 96 miles around West Berlin until 1989, when East German authorities reluctantly agreed to open crossings following mass protests. Mr. Steinmeier called on Germans not to let the memories of that period fade and urged them to actively participate in democracy, including by voting in the country's national election next month. Egyptian officials say a roadside bomb in the Sinai Peninsula has exploded, killing 7 members of security forces. The so-called Islamic State claimed responsibility for the attack in a statement on an IS-affiliated website. Egypt has been battling militants in northern Sinai for years. Authorities in Belarus have detained over 20 people, continuing a crackdown on dissent. The latest wave of arrests comes a year after a disputed presidential election. The vote was rejected as a sham by the opposition and the West. Mr. Lukashenko responded with repression, resulting in over 35,000 people arrested. Belarusian authorities have ramped up the clampdown in recent months, arresting independent journalists, activists, and others deemed disloyal. The UN Special Envoy for Somalia is reporting significant progress in getting an agreement to hold national elections. But James Swan said greater efforts are needed to ensure electoral security in light of the ongoing threat from the Al-Shabaab extremist group. Turkish officials say search and rescue crews have pulled 10 more bodies from the rubble and debris following severe floods and mudslides that struck the north of the country. This brings the overall death toll to 27, with at least 1 more person missing. The floods had battered Black Sea coastal provinces on Wednesday, demolishing homes and bridges and sweeping away cars. Hundreds of people were rescued by helicopters. Human rights experts working with the United Nations are calling for more rules on spyware. The 8 experts called on countries to pause the sale and transfer of spyware until they set rules for its use. This follows further Pegasus spyware revelations from an international media consortium last month. It found the military-grade Pegasus malware from Israel-based NSO Group, a hacker-for-hire outfit, has been used to spy on journalists, human rights activists, and political dissidents. Samsung leader Lee Jae-Yong walked out of prison a year early after a parole decision. Mr. Lee bowed in apology over the anger ignited by his crimes, which were related to the explosive corruption scandal that toppled South Korea's previous president in 2017. His corporate crown jewel, Samsung Electronics, represents about 20% of South Korea's stock market value and 1/4 of its total exports. Business leaders and key government figures had endorsed Mr. Lee's early release. The Australian government says it remains seriously concerned about the welfare of a Chinese-born Australian journalist a year after she was first detained in China. Foreign Minister Marise Payne says Australia expects basic standards of justice, procedural fairness, and humane treatment to be met. Worsening bilateral relations since Australia called for an independent investigation into the origins of the coronavirus pandemic are suspected by many to be the cause of Cheng Lai's arrest. New Zealand has long been associated with the Lord of the Rings, but after a recent decision over a new TV series, the nation may have become more like Mordor than the Shire for hundreds of workers. In a major blow to the nation's small but vibrant screen industry, Amazon Studios says the second season of its original series, inspired by J.R.R. Tolkien, is being moved to Britain. New Zealand government figures show the production is one of the most expensive in history, with Amazon spending at least $465 million on the first season, which just finished filming. All right, I'm Nima Rajan, and that'll do it for your look at national and international news for today. Take care, Canada. We'll see you next time.